if we're talking about creating, a better world, a more fair, just world, a world, more connected to nature, where nature can thrive, then actually it really pays to every so often kind of be brave and look into the fringes for those answers, because actually more often than not, anything that you would deem to be a societal norm now has come from the fringes.
And that voice you just heard was my producer Sam, along with his toddler. You just heard there as well, because that's how we roll on this podcast. In a voice note as we were going back and forth about this episode 22. So yeah, hey folks, welcome to If I Ruled the World, the podcast that's all about system change and making the world a better place. I like to say it's true, there are 8 billion people on the planet, so I'll put money on the fact that there are 8 billion different versions of what a better place looks like. So this podcast is all about exploring that, as many different versions of what a better place could look like. Oh, and talking about a better place, I've stayed off social media this past week. I've said it before on this podcast. I have a real love-hate relationship with social media. It can be so entertaining, so addictive. It can connect us, it can inspire us, educate us, organize. So much good can come out of it, but it also really fucking sucks when it's used to crank up the dial on hate. So that's why I've been keeping away from it for a while. So I'm sorry if I've missed your comments. But yeah, I guess this whole experience is giving me the kick up the butt I need to resurrect my newsletter. And if you haven't already, you can sign up to my newsletter via my website, gillianburkevoice.com. And the newsletter will be letting you know when podcast episodes are going to drop, and also other events, like I do talks and storytelling and other events. Campaigns. It's going to be light touch. I'm not going to flood your inbox, but hopefully it's another way to keep in touch if, like me, you need to take social media breaks, release yourself from the algorithm every now and again, but still want to keep in touch, like Maya, who sent a message in answer to the question, what sort of things would you like us to cover on the podcast? And I found this one really intriguing, Maya. You said, might sound strange, but how to be an authentic human, how to be brave in the face of judgment, how to believe in the inner voice, the higher self, the one who knows how to use the wisdom meaningfully. Maya, that's not strange. And I think this episode is for you and anyone else who struggles with this, how to stay true to ourselves. And that, by the way, I think it resonates because it really connects with me. So I played you a little snippet earlier of producer Sam bouncing around some ideas on the theme of this episode. Like, what is the theme? Because perhaps more than any of our other guests to date, today's guest took us to the fringes of how we perceive our world. And it just defied the format of our podcast. And it just wasn't the conversation that we were expecting, but it was a beautiful conversation nevertheless. So today's guest is Stella Marie, a Cardiff-born artist who is exploring her Celtic roots, Indigenous culture, and with a worldview, as you'll hear in this interview, that has a heavy, heavy lean into animism. So this way of seeing the world where everything, human and non-human, is seen as a sovereign entity. It's going to challenge you if you're not used to thinking like this, but I really, really hope you stick with it. Because, first of all, it's a peaceful conversation that bounces between beautiful, magical thoughts, ideas, and experiences, but has come from the depths of addiction, of loss, of mental health challenges, and touches on the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. Oh man, some parts of this really stretched us as a team. I'm not going to lie, some parts actually really scared me. But more than anything, we recorded this podcast episode just before things started getting nasty in England. So, violent mobs roaming the streets, terrorizing people. It feels really right for this gentle conversation around a search for belonging and a search for feeling proud of who you are, where you come from, without feeling threatened or being threatening. For Stella, this journey began with what she calls a spiritual awakening.
In university, I was in what I'd call like the New Age spiritual movement. My spiritual life was very much wanting to escape these lands. I felt like there was nothing here, and I felt that I needed to move away. But when I was growing up, when I was younger, my grandfather loved walking. He has walked across Britain. He's done, 3-day hikes where he would go to a little pub, stay at that pub, drink their local ale, and then do a walk to a next pub the next night and drink their local ale. And he loved the countryside. But again, it wasn't something that I was into. I thought, oh, that's boring. It's not something that was natural to me to be so passionate about the natural world and the history here. So back to being in university, I'm having my spiritual awakening, which was brought on by many things, but it was the realization that the world that we live in can be so much brighter, and that there's a divinity to life itself. And as soon as I realized this, I started seeing the beauty in the world, but also in contrast, the darkness that came along with it. So my spiritual self was wanting to find the love and the light and the beauty. And I looked online and found it in other cultures. So, for example, getting into Buddhism for the peace, Hinduism for their vast array of stories that express the spiritual journey of human consciousness in all its many different facets and forms, and then looking towards the indigenous Native Americans, towards how they truly honored and respected the land spirits. And I thought, well, I've got to get out of here. I've got to get out of Britain because we haven't got any of that here. Yeah. And I was planning to travel the world. Actually, I was planning to leave. I wanted to go to Bali. It's very much influenced by the spiritual influences that are like, you got to travel the world to find yourself. And I thought that I had to leave to find myself. And then in university, I found, while I was looking at mandalas in architecture, I was in the architecture section in university, and I found a book on Celtic artifacts. And I opened it, and there was a copper plaque from a shield from about 1,500 years ago in North Wales. And the art was just so beautiful and just so representative of the art that I saw in other cultures. I was like, there's something here. Wow. And I found that the majority of the people around me at the time who were from, so I'm Welsh, I'm from South Wales, that were from Britain, where they just were also wanting to leave, also really inspired by other cultures. And it was that day in the library looking at the Celtic artifacts that brought me to go on this deep dive into digging up the mysteries within the spiritual and sacred history of this culture. What we know today is based on what was written by the invaders, in a sense, and by the Christians and by the Romans. It can't be. Our sacred history pre-colonization on these lands can't be pulled apart from Christianity and Roman mythology. It's intertwined, and it's a big mystery. And I love that.
That's really beautiful, actually. That's really beautiful and interesting that you're not trying to separate it out. At least the way you describe that, it can't be entwined. It can't be separated out. It's deeply entwined with Roman mythology and Christianity. Tell me a bit about sort of what it was like growing up in South Wales. And you talked about wanting to look for the light and for the beauty in the world. What drove you?
Yeah, so I describe my childhood and the world, like I was brought up in two worlds. So on the one hand, my grandparents were my guardians and they brought me up, and they are from, they're sort of middle, upper class, but my grandfather was born in poverty. He really had to work his way up, and I had food on the table, and I had a house to live in, and I had sort of a really gifted childhood with them. But on the other hand, I had my parents who, both of them have passed on now. Actually, my father died when I was 16. My mother died in 2020, both due to mental health. Yeah, mental health and addiction, but ultimately because of the lack of support that our society has for people who are different. I feel that I really witnessed how if you conform into a certain way of being in not just South Wales, but in this Western society, you're really encouraged and empowered to be who you are. But if you're different, if you're more on the creative and rebellious side, society has sort of got this program that pushes you down and tries to squeeze you into a box that you can't fit into. And this is where I saw my parents didn't fit into that box. And I used to feel that they couldn't sort of handle this world in a sense, but it's not this world, it's the world that the Western world tries to fit us into. And I think the mental health crisis across the world is because of that, because it's trying to fit the shape of flowers into small little boxes, so we can't bloom. And that causes a lot of issues. So my growing up in South Wales was in the city, in the industrial city of Cardiff, where often you have to get a magnifying glass to know that you're in Wales because it's so industrialized. But also then having my grandparents who were very much into nature, into education, into music. My granddad is a huge blues fan. He would share blues music with me, real R&B, rhythm and blues, the R&B of the old world. Very cultured man. So I had this experience of sort of light and darkness, which has brought me to, really want to help the world. And it was so after my dad had passed away, my mum guided me into reconnecting with the natural world and music as a way to grieve. And it was that reconnection to the natural world and to music that helped me to grieve. And through witnessing like the transformation of death and rebirth, like in real time, it's shown me how to move through darkness and how to bring light through that.
It's really beautiful when you talk about your grandparents and particularly your grandfather. You always put your hand on your chest. I've just been noticing that. That's obviously really deep connection, gratitude to that. When you talk about your parents and mental health, I think a lot of people will resonate with this kind of, like it's almost like a contradiction, like it's treated as a pathology and can be, right? But a lot of people, myself included, who will have had relatives with various kind of degrees of mental health challenges on one end of the spectrum are actually incredibly creative. And, I really recognize what you're saying. Like, time in Britain when there was, it looked different. The connection with nature was different. And then you look beyond Britain and the British Isles, where we are now. And how do you explain the kind of connection lost here?
I would say that it is the oral tradition and the stories and the mythologies. When looking at all Native and Indigenous cultures, story is so important, and song is so important. Language is so important. So here in Wales, we are fighting to keep our names for areas because it's a lot easier to pronounce the English versions of our names. So for some time now, we've been really fighting to preserve those names. And the names describe the area and often can describe the history of the area. So, for example, Abergavenny, it means the wide mouth of the river. When it comes to the languages, so I'm really big on how the English language is lacking in life in many ways. So, for example, we don't look at a tree and a tree is just like sort of we're taught that it's an inanimate object. We don't value a tree in the same way as we'd value a friend or a human or a dog. And this is because the way that the language is designed. There are Indigenous cultures around the world who see tree as friend within the language that they use. There are stories that they tell their people that are stories embedded in the culture of natural objects or resources that remind them of their inherent divinity and value. And this is something that here in the ancient Brythonic languages and the Welsh language and the Cornish language and the Gaelic languages, that we do this too. We have stories and myths and legends that remind us of the divinity of the natural world.
So basically, like in the run up to speaking to you, I had this conversation with Jake and Sam. And halfway through the conversation, it sort of started to occur to me that when I said the word Indigenous, or when we hear the word Indigenous, people see something in their minds, and each person sees something quite different. So, like everyone does, I hopped onto the internet, I did a search for a definition, and there's sort of dictionary definitions, but actually I came across a really interesting document, a UN document, which was about 2 sides of A4, about what does this mean? And it sort of began by saying there's no fixed definition of Indigenous because of the diversity of people who self-identify as Indigenous. So then it sort of carried on for a working document. So I just wondered if you can tell me, like, I know what Indigenous means to me, but I would be really interested to know what it means to you. Like, what do you see?
So when I talk about being Indigenous, I'm talking about cultures and practices and languages here in Britain and Wales. And I think it's really important to know that that's what I'm talking about. And prior to talking about my own lineage, I was really interested in learning from Indigenous cultures around the world. So I began this journey by looking at Indigenous peoples. And as you said, the cultures are so different across the world. And it's really important to be sensitive towards the way that these cultures, as individual cultures and peoples, understand what indigeneity and Indigenous means to them. And that is something that I have come across as an issue sharing online, especially when it comes to short bits of content when people aren't really seeing the full picture, because they do have this image of what Indigenous is. And say in America, for example, or Australia, it has, when talking about the indigeneity of place and people, it's got a different meaning attached to it.
But what do you see when you talk about Indigenous? Like, what different things are you seeing in your mind's eye? Yeah. I don't know, not everyone necessarily works, not everyone works in that way, but for me, I definitely kind of have images that flash up, but I just wondered if you do.
So when you looked into the definition of an Indigenous, there's lots of different definitions depending on which avenue you're going down, but the baseline is like naturally occurring from and coming from land and a specific area, like emerging from that area. Mm-hmm. Whether that's the people, their language, the clothing they wear, whatever it is, it's an expression of the land around them, because that's what we are. We are simply earth expressing itself in a human way. And the languages that we speak, whatever comes through us, is earth's voice coming through us as individuals and communities.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Wales, the Welsh are known as the people of song and the land of song. And recently I've been coming to this realization that we feel so lost because we don't know our language. So to get to know a culture is to get to know its language. You'll hear, if you're going on holiday, if you really want to understand that culture, learn their language. And then I think we don't know our languages. Most of us don't know our languages. Like, no wonder we're so lost and we don't really understand ourselves or who we are or our origins. And it's been a real deep grief of mine recently because I don't speak Welsh, but I've been trying to go to Welsh folk, going to Welsh folk performances. And when I hear people speaking in Welsh and singing in Welsh and I don't know what they're saying, I literally get brought to tears sometimes. And I'm pretty sure we can all, those of us who don't have that connection to our lineage, we feel that, oh God, there's something in me that wants to know that, and that was taken from me. It's looking at those little bits that reflect not just the ancient past, but reflect something that's emerging from the land there and then. I don't think it's essential to go back, actually. I think it's essential to listen to the land and allow that area. So re-inhabiting is something that I like to use sometimes instead of re-indigenizing, but re-inhabiting the land. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Re-inhabiting, that's really interesting. So re-inhabiting is the word, the language that you're using to try and cast this forward into the future. So it's not a case of being nostalgic about some faded, distant past, but actually trying to reclaim something for a future. So like an ancient future, essentially. I just want to jump in with a quick shout out to the exclusive sponsors of If I Rule the World. The ethical and sustainable bank, Triodos Bank UK. They're, ethical and sustainable. They've been around in the UK trying to change the financial system from the inside out for over 30 years now. And I tell you what, they've been doing this long before it was the trendy thing to do or to be banging on about it. So I came across Triodos. Basically, I used to walk past their offices that were initially in an old Georgian building just up from where I used to live in Bristol. And that's kind of where my awareness started, and it grew as just quite organically over the years. I had a friend who worked in their call center. They still have a call center, by the way. You can actually speak to a real human pretty much straight away, which is so cool. And eventually I made the switch a few years back because I wanted to know that what money I do have isn't going to fund the arms industry or fossil fuel companies, but actually backs companies and community projects and ventures that have genuinely sound environmental and social responsibility policies. So if you're interested, look them up, Triodos Bank UK. But for now, let's get back to it. Stella, what would you do? What could you do if you really had that incredible power to rule the world? Like, how would you take everything that you care so deeply about and start to weave it into a future and create a world that you feel sort of is what you'd like to see? So if you rule the world, is there anything that you would straight off the bat ban, outlaw?
I fully believe that and I know that the actions that we take every single day are based on what is within the mind and what is within us. It's something like 95% of our thoughts are the same as the day before. So I'm really big on, and I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that and work on reprogramming the subconscious mind so that then we can reprogram the shame within us, the fears within us, and all of these, like the disempowerment within us, which is placed upon us by schools, society, our upbringing, our environment. But a lot of it is to do with what's constantly surrounding us on the media and in the radio and advertisements. So I would ban any disempowering and shame-based and fear-based advertisements. I would not allow that to be anywhere because it's infecting us. this constant fear and shame is infecting us from the inside, which is causing us to act in a way that isn't of our highest good. So I would ban that everywhere. Even for the people who are in power, who aren't making the best decisions, if they're listening to the radio, if they ever go anywhere, they have to listen to this empowering, positive, uplifting messages to uplift their spirits and start to reprogram their minds. So yeah, that is what I'd ban.
So you've got a handle on messaging. You can't necessarily control, as leader of the world, the kind of story, the experiences of everyone up until the point that you take power. But that's the first thing you do is you're like, we're going to turn the tap off of the messaging that reinforces the trauma, the fear.
Yeah, it's the stories. It's all coming back to the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we tell ourselves about the world around us, the stories that we tell ourselves about whether the trees are just objects that we can cut down to make tables, or whether they are living beings that actually allow us to exist. You know, the stories we tell ourselves about whether water is this divine goddess that is within us as well, because we are water, or water is just this resource that we can shove in a tank and put chemicals into so we can feed people. It's reprogramming the stories, the technology that we have to do that. Like the things go viral, like a piece of toast can go viral, for God's sake, because it's got a picture of Michael Jackson on, for, you know, just something random like that can go viral. So if we can have a story of just pure beauty and empowerment and encouragement and reminding us of who we truly are, go viral, that's what I do. Because it's so possible, I think. I work in social media, so I know how easy it is to do that on a small scale. But if I ruled the world and I could do it on a big scale, yeah, that's what I'd be doing.
So it'd be working, because from what I know about, from what I've read, that negative bias is sort of like a survival mechanism, that we pay more attention to threat than to something that's comforting. Although, I don't know, cute cats seem to somehow win over threat as well when it comes to social media. But so that would be really interesting. That would be the first thing that you do, is change the stories we tell ourselves by banning negative messaging. So the word policy may not really suit your leadership style. Just listening to the way you're speaking right now, I can really get that.
Yeah, I'm not massively political, but
yeah. So maybe you help sort of start to change leadership style by coming up with something that replaces these kind of words like policies and laws. But you know, what three things, let's just say for now, for want of a better word, would you introduce? Would you begin? So you've said you're going to swap out and ban sort of negative messaging and start resetting the stories we tell ourselves. What other three things would you do?
So there's one thing about all native cultures, is that they moved with the seasons because they had to for survival. And I think that's something we're lacking. And I would make it so that every single school, especially private schools, had to celebrate and honor Earth's time and the solar system's time. And had to visually see what is happening to the land around them as the season changes. To know that sometimes we don't get food and why that is. I feel like we don't see the reality that when the summer ends, the land is dying, because our fridge is still full. We can still go to the shop. I would make it so that all schools in the world have to move with the seasons, that the education system moves with the seasons, and that there's a lot more vocational. Yeah, the subjects are more vocational and on the land and land-based. So I'd make the education system a process of re-inhabiting.
So as you say that, I've sort of realized I'm actually a more visual person than I realized. I started to see almost like a patchwork quilt sort of starting to cover the land, because I can't see how you'd be able to have a blanket policy for the whole world. Like each locality would almost like evolve its own unique sort of picture of what that's like, educating with the seasons. So let's start with South Wales, because that's what you know. Like, just talk me through a school year in South Wales, as ruler of the world, kind of set this as the new way of doing things. What would that school year look like, and what events, what festivals might you celebrate?
So when it comes to like traditional celebrations, seasonal celebrations, it's about community and coming together to celebrate and have fun, to feel joy. So it's something that people look forward to, and it's something that we should want, to come together and sing with each other. Singing is naturally releases oxytocin, so it naturally makes us feel good. When you sing with other people, it amplifies that oxytocin release. So it looks like singing together, and it might look like some hippie stuff, but it's really what humans are made for. I think we're made to sing together, and we're made to dance together, and we're made to feel silly together, and we're made to sort of like cheers that really nice drink from berries that we've harvested together and feel like taste, pleasure, enjoy. It's about enjoying life, really. And that's what would happen in school. So in South Wales, the kids would be preparing for that, getting ready for that.
Yeah. Because what I find interesting, again, just sort of looking at the kind of seasonality and the awareness of seasons, like on the British Isles, like I came to the UK, gosh, in 92, so I was sort of 19 years old, and I mean, I had no idea that there was anything other than the culture I saw around me. And I've kind of always been a West Country girl somehow. I've always either lived in Bristol, now I live in Cornwall. And it wasn't until I had my children, and they were in a preschool, and they were actually in like an ecological school, like 2 years. So it's like, it is exactly as it sounds. And they started to celebrate festivals that I'd never heard of, which I found really fascinating, like Imbolc, for example. And what was really fascinating to me was that this was the festival that was celebrated what felt like in the deep midwinter, but it was actually the beginning of spring. And then when I sort of went into the scientific literature, I found that actually that point in the calendar, which is sort of halfway through January, is also when soil temperatures, start to rise. So imperceptibly, you wouldn't know unless you stuck a thermometer in the ground that actually something is changing, and that slight change is triggering the sort of nascent life, the seeds and everything that's just waiting to spring. Like that all is starting to stir. So it's all out of view. Mm-hmm. It's all hidden away. And it's only because a bunch of scientists were like, oh, let's just study the soil and figure out what's going on through the year, that they found that same point that pagans and sort of ancient people would have been celebrating is Imbolc. It is the beginning of spring. And so for someone like me who's quite disconnected from natural cycles in the way the indigenous people experience them, to me, I found that so fascinating that somehow a 2,000 plus year old festival was marking the point that scientists had found that at least in temperate climates in the Northern Hemisphere is when soil temperatures start to reach their lowest point and start to creep up again. And I just thought that was really, really fascinating. Do you find do you celebrate those points in the festival, in the sort of the pagan calendar?
Some of them, yeah, when I feel drawn to celebrate them. I celebrated the summer solstice this year, which was phenomenal. It was at a small arts commune here in South Wales that I was brought up going to and from. And it was only a small little festival. There was about 200 people. All of the food there was grown from the land. So it's a commune. It's a sustainable commune. All the food there was delicious, and it was all seasonal. And we didn't do any traditional Welsh practices, but it could, because Cardiff is so multicultural, we've got to honor that people are going to come with their different traditions from around the world. So this little festival is actually that. It's a bringing people together on the land. And that was beautiful. And it's a celebration of summer. And again, it's joy. It's having fun together. These things are a lot more simple, I think, than we make out in the modern world. And yeah, I've also questioned, like, how is it? And I think we all do, like we feel, how is it that the people in the past knew all of this? And it's an inner knowing. It's just an instinctual, we are actually a part of the seasonal cycle. We are the seasonal cycle. It's not this thing that happens outside of us. We are the seasonal cycle. You know, we can see how seasonal affective disorder, like depression, I don't think it's natural for human beings to become depressed in the winter. I think it's because if we carry on as if it's summer in the winter, whereas traditionally it was a time for rest, because we wouldn't have been working on the land as much. We would have been together telling stories around the fire and enjoying just being together. And we can see in our society today, looking at our families, looking at our friends, that because we're not following these seasons, the mental health of people we know is drastically impacted. And that is because we have forgotten time, in a sense. The earth cycles are there constantly. So let's realign with that and remember who we truly are. We don't need the science to tell us, but it's good that it is, because the logical mind of today, I'm one of those logically minded people. It can help us to, the evidence can help us to take action.
What's the second thing that you would do?
It would be about water. It would be about, it wouldn't be a policy, but ending this war on water, or at least showing the world that there is a war on water happening right now. Education on water would be, that would probably be it. Like education on water being mandatory across the world in the education systems. Water is today seen as something we just drink for hydration, whereas the amount of water that it takes to create the bottle that the water is in, it's like we are so severed from the reality of what water is. It's mind-blowing, actually. We look towards Indigenous cultures who honor water as a goddess, the most divine goddess that we could imagine. And then you compare that to how we in the West see water. We've got a lot of water here in like Cornwall and Wales, so we don't really have to treat it as precious as in other countries where they are lacking in water. But still, we should really care for it. And coming back to the language again, so like when I grew up, I saw Earth as this blue marble, right? So like Earth is a blue marble, like that's an inanimate object that you sort of like just throw on the ground. Look at how other cultures see it as a Mother Earth, this water goddess. It's just like changing how we view water and Earth in some way.
I'm actually just going to sort of jump tracks massively right now, because when we sort of in the prep for this conversation, we found one of your TikTok posts which talked about a real kind of epiphany, like a real kind of watershed moment for you, where you sort of went, I'm assuming it was sort of like on a healing journey with psychedelics, and that completely changed you called it your soul purpose. And bearing in mind, you could do absolutely anything as ruler of the world. I just thought, let's jump tracks for a second. And I just really want to know about that.
Yeah, so actually, I like that you've asked. I wasn't sure whether I could talk about it, but after my dad had passed, actually, my mum guided me through a psychedelic journey with the local mushroom. So she picked them. She had a deep connection with the mushroom of the land. And so her addictions were with everything from alcohol to hard drugs. And the mushrooms were the only things that would literally full stop cut her addiction off, to the point where she would be in ruins one day and then she'd have a psychedelic mushroom experience, a meeting of the spirit of the mushroom, and it would remind her of the love in the world, which is what these mushrooms do. And she then after that would not have that addiction anymore. So my experience with it was I was grieving my dad's passing, because it was a very traumatic time for me. And I was drinking lots of alcohol every single night. I was borderline, like I was hanging around with people who were doing drugs that my mum recognized being her daughter, how we follow our parents' patterns. My mum was like, I need to stop her in her tracks before she becomes, an addict herself. And she introduced me to the mushroom in a ceremony. So she took me through a ceremony. We don't have like elders to show us how to work with the psychedelic plants of this land. So they are scary because we don't know how to work with them. We don't have lineages of thousands of years like they do in the Americas with their ayahuasca traditions. But my mum intuitively had worked with the mushrooms her whole life and took me through that ceremony. And prior to that ceremony, I had post-traumatic stress disorder. So I wasn't diagnosed, but I know I did because the sounds of ambulances would like cause me to black out. I was going through like all sorts. I was numbing myself with alcohol basically. And then I went through that mushroom journey, and the mushroom so I see them as individual spirits that are very intelligent. And we have always, as human beings, had a relationship with these animals as spirits, as beings that are just as intelligent as us. I mean, I'm sure you know about how intelligent the mushroom kingdom is, like, wow. And my meeting with them, they basically showed me that life is a beautiful pattern of, how did I describe it? But the experience allowed me to shed all of the ideas that I'd attached to my identity about what life was, what my experience was, and who I was. And it brought me to a place of seeing clearly the harmonious nature of Earth. That's what the role of the mushroom did for me in that moment, along with the music my mum was playing for me. And she'd also given me these cards that had quotes on them. And I contemplated them, like, an eye for an eye will make the whole world blind. I remember looking at that, and she was like, how does this, make you feel? And sharing songs with me, and we sang. And yeah, it's just this whole process of returning to a state of being human and being of nature, which massively contrasted drinking alcohol to numb yourself. And then after that, my entire life changed after that, basically. I believe that because these mushrooms cover these lands every single autumn, it was probably very natural for people to just sort of pick them and eat them and sort of live in this sort of psychedelic state. Yeah, in the past, like since having that experience, it doesn't make sense to me that they didn't ever eat them. Again, archaeologists might say there's no evidence to prove that our ancestors ever ate these mushrooms. And I'm like, they literally cover the land once a year for 3 months. I'm pretty sure they did at some point. So no, thank you for asking me about that.
Well, I mean, I just want to know more because, did you feel, because I'm just trying to imagine someone listening to this who has no experience of psychedelics, has no experience. And, really about our social conditioning is, this is something that you do when, you're either partying or you're being irresponsible or, you know what I mean? It's just not an accepted way of handling any aspect of life as far as, kind of the cultural norms. I wonder whether you feel that you've got to explain kind of what it did for your mom, and therefore was this a responsible or irresponsible thing to be doing as a mother with her daughter? Like, I know for some people that's going to really jar. So I just wondered if you can just, how did that seem to you?
Yeah, so to me, I follow someone online who comes from a lineage where they, and in a native lineage where it is traditional and very normal for the mothers to take their daughters through a psychedelic initiation. I don't see them as drugs at all. I see alcohol as a drug. I see a lot of pharmaceuticals that are given out freely to 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds as drugs. I see these plants that we're able to grow in our garden as plants, and we should be taught about them and how to use them. And the reason that we misuse them is because we're not taught how to use them. We're not,
Right.
we don't know what they are, you know. So that's what I'd say to anyone who's listening, thinking that it's really irresponsible. I'd say that it's really irresponsible to sell alcohol. Full stop. I'd say it's irresponsible to have, you know, have a rehab center and then up the road have an advertisement of vodka on a billboard. I'd say that's incredibly irresponsible and damaging. Not not picking a mushroom in a field that's already there and seeing what it's like.
God, man, when you put it like that. So just to go back to this kind of little thought experiment that we're doing, little game, which is you have the power to switch that up. What would it look like? You know, how would you introduce this into and normalize into society, into Western society, I should say, and I guess the world, because now we're talking about the world. How would you normalize that?
I would create a council of elders who are from surviving Indigenous traditions that work with the medicines still. I would create a council and have them inform the pharmaceutical industry that is currently trying to work with these medicines. And so currently there's a society called the Psychedelic Society. I don't know if you've heard of them. Here in the UK, they've got labs and they work with introducing psychedelic medicines into therapies, and they are trialing and testing them out. But it is following the same methods and processes as to what the pharmaceutical industry does when it extracts certain bits from plants and leaves the rest behind. I know that there's someone that I know who is a native. I don't know them too well, but they share a lot on Instagram. They're a native to a psychedelic community in America, a surviving tradition that works with the plant spirits. And they say that the way that the pharmaceutical industry is currently extracting the best bit from, like, say, mushrooms, is taking the spirit out of the plant, because it's not just about the mushroom, it's about the ceremony. So the way that you work with these plants completely defines the experience you're going to have. So I sort of see it like these plants, like the mushrooms, are they're conscious, and like my experience with them was that it is an interaction and a relationship that you're forming with earth and the mushroom, and that if you disrespect them, they jump out of the room and they let whatever happens because of their very wise. So when you've got people who are doing them at house parties and they don't know what they're doing, the mushroom is like, what are you like? It's too much. So the mushroom sort of just like jumps out of the room and lets whatever happens, and then it all goes wrong. Whereas if you sit in ceremony traditionally with this mushroom with intention and you speak to it, it can really help you and guide you. And the only way to understand how to do that is to listen to the surviving elders within these traditions who are still doing that. And I'd bring them together. Yeah.
So I find it like, I love the mushroom kingdom, sort of almost like nations alongside our human nations.
Yes. Yeah.
And like a cross-fertilization of ideas and energy and experiences. And then I'm like, would Stella pre this experience, what would you gone through your mind if you heard this conversation right now?
I would probably have been intrigued, but I think there's something within us all that knows about the profound transformation, which is frightening in itself. I think there's something within us that understands that, similar to birth, it's like you listen to it and you hear about it as a young girl and you're like, nuh-uh. Like, I'm not looking forward to that. But you also know that it's really, it's important and it's natural. So yeah, I felt like that, but I was a very different person then. I wouldn't be who I am now if it wasn't for that experience, the same as I wouldn't be who I am now if it wasn't for having my son, who is, he's coming up to 2 years old.
Wow.
So yeah, birth is a massively psychedelic experience, massively transformative. You're sort of put into another world. You have to surrender, which is something you have to do with a psychedelic experience. You surrender. The more you hold on, the harder it gets. The more you let go, apparently, the easier it gets. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I wonder whether that's what has always scared me about psychedelics. I've never done anything trippy because I am possibly scared of what I'm going to have to let go of, which is almost everything that I've wrapped around in my identity and my education, the fact that I've got a biology degree and, like so much stuff. Like I imagine, like it really scares me. And when I hear you talk about how it's transformed you, I don't know why it scares me, but it does.
Yeah.
And it's not because of any societal pressure. It's more just I'm oh God, is it that I worry that it will really challenge me to align completely with what I say I believe in and the way I live. And I know those two things are out of whack. I know that. But yeah, Jesus, holy crap.
Yeah, I
Stella.
completely agree because I feel that exact way. I feel that way. Yeah, just because I've had the experience, it's different every time. I mean, I've changed so much since that experience. It's not something that I do now all the time. And I do believe that when we feel a calling, that we should follow it with these experiences. And there is that psychedelic society who is here with a very professional way of approaching this. Very, yeah, they're doing it properly. I definitely wouldn't recommend people doing it just randomly in the way that I did it. I'm lucky to have had a family member who had a very deep connection in ceremony with the mushroom. Not many people have that, but there are people like the Psychedelic Society who are currently doing trials with it, where I would say if anyone is called to do it, reach out to them. They do like live calls where you can jump on and listen to them talking about it. Yeah, they also are in communication with elders around the world who work with these medicines. So yeah, go down the proper route.
Yeah. You know what? That 100% sounds like part and parcel of like how you've had that experience and how it's been transformational in a positive way for you. I mean, I honestly think now that we've opened up this part of the conversation, like the usual questions I would ask about if you rule the world, just it's like they can't fit in this box anymore. You know what I mean? So I'm now imagining a world where you're the ruler. You've created beautiful things, you've sort of banned bad advertising, but actually now you've really gotten to the heart of what you stand for. And that is that bringing people in relationship with these spirits, whether from the mushroom kingdom or otherwise from the plant kingdom, that help us to, go through a transformation of whatever that looks like for different people. My concern for you is there are a lot of people in the world. There are 8 billion of us at the moment. And as a ruler, how are you going to deal with the people that resist this? Because, I mean, are you going to be the kind of ruler that goes, right, lock them up? Or like, how do you bring what you've learned from the mushrooms to dealing with the resistance to your policies?
I guess I'm going to get super personally spiritual here with the way that I understand our individual evolution, and is that there has to be a fall for a rise. And there is a tarot card called the Tower, which basically symbolizes that falling and how the tower has to fall in order for it to be built again. So I feel that when it comes to the resistance, that resistance is like the sort of like visualize a like a lotus flower, like pushing through the mud, like is a very common like analogy. But that resistance, the more it resists, or the more like a flower before it blossoms resists, and then it blossoms into something big and beautiful. I would just trust that resistance and that the sort of falling of everything is a part of something new blooming through and blossoming out of it. And just as my experiences have taught me to just surrender and trust that things are going the way they need to go, but not in a way that like everything will be all right, man, just chill, don't worry. No, I'm very like practical and I get stuff done. But through that also just be like, okay, that's fine. You don't have to do this. That's fine. You're on your own journey. And I think this is, as you said, the thing that you're in fear of with the mushroom is knowing that you're going to have to sort of fall and surrender and things are going to fall away in order for something new to come through. But that which is new that comes through is usually quite beautiful in my experience.
I'm trying to imagine this massive rebellion of people who, for all sorts of reasons, feel either too scared or think it's not the right thing to do, to surrender to the mushroom kingdom and let the mushroom kingdom rule through you.
I don't feel. I don't
love
feel
it,
that
though.
everyone should experience the mushroom. I feel like everyone should experience the change in seasons with their community. I think that's the main thing, and that's the most important thing. Not everyone needs to surrender to the mushroom kingdom.
I thought this was going to be a conversation about British Indigenous culture, but I think it's about animism. It's about the ability to see non-human life as truly equal. It's about casting off human supremacy. It's about practicing ecological humility. All these are ideas that were introduced by a previous guest on the podcast, Leah Penniman, episode 21. And I didn't realize that those themes would be continued in this conversation with Stella through her very personal experience. I think there's a case to be made that we're all natural-born animists. I'm not the only one, by the way. This comes from studies in developmental psychology, and particularly there's a Swiss developmental psychologist, Jean Piaget, who described that this is how all children see life. They see life as consciousness, as having consciousness. So all non-human life, I should say, as having consciousness, as having agency. And they see this in many things that us adults just take to be unconscious, inanimate objects. So, just putting that into plain speak, basically just think about when your toys could talk or when trees could walk. I remember definitely as a kid, I could imagine, not all trees, but there were certain trees I could 100% could have sworn that at night they pull their roots out of the ground and they walk around. I was just convinced of it. I don't know when I grew out of that, actually. But anyway, imagination, playfulness, the suspension of disbelief, all of this stuff is what we need for creative thinking, for problem solving, and believe it or not, fueling further scientific inquiry. I think a lot of people are now familiar with, what scientists call the wood wide web. So the subterranean fungal network, mycelium, that connects trees and mediates the communication between trees in a forest. The idea, even just 10, 15 years ago, that trees could actually talk to each other with fungal mediators would have literally just had you, relegated to that. Just would have been relegated to the realms of fantasy. So who knows what the fungal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the mineral kingdom, the animal kingdom, what all of these have to teach us, have to still teach us. Maybe we're just not asking the right questions. It's not about all of us having the same mindset, but it is inviting and being open-minded and welcoming and tolerant of different mindsets, maybe. Because it's been said before, trying to problem solve from the same mindset that created the problem in the first place is never going to work. I don't know. Let me know what you think. You can comment on Spotify. You can email me on gillianburkevoice.com. You can comment on Instagram. I will be back on the social media when this episode drops. You can find Stella on Instagram and on YouTube, as well as links to some of the resources she mentioned. All of that is in the show notes. I think I'm going to leave it there, man, because the world's a pretty crazy place out there at the moment, folks. But I take heart that there are still plenty of people who are aligned with their authentic selves, who are willing to do the right thing, even when it doesn't suit them. Find their stories as a way to counter that negative news and disempowering media messaging that Stella was talking about. Maybe try out some of Stella's other ideas, although a little disclaimer, don't do drugs, kids. But more than anything, thank you so much for listening. And for now, I'm just going to say, my usual, take a moment, take a breath, and ask yourself, if you rule the world, what would you do? Thanks for listening.